If they start teaching us about credit cards and how to use credit card responsibly, then credit card companies won't be able to make money anymore.
If you've clicked on this video, you're probably familiar with this kind of sentiment.
Why aren't we taught financial literacy in school?
Imagine if school taught us compound interest over mitochondria being the powerhouses.
Credit card debt isn't taught in high school.
To some extent, research supports this. According to a 2019 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, over half of US adults are considered financially illiterate. And that lack of literacy is one driving force behind the financial instability a lot of Americans face. We're over $1 trillion in credit card debt, over a quarter of us don't have any retirement savings, and over a third of us would struggle to cover a $400 emergency expense. So perhaps it's no surprise that 88% of adults agree that high school should require financial literacy courses. But for many of us, it's not quite true that we were never taught anything. So maybe the question isn't why didn't we learn this stuff, but rather why don't we remember any of it? And how do we change that? There's actually a pretty straightforward way to determine if you're financially literate. A simple set of questions known as the Big Three. One about interest rates, one about inflation, and one about risk diversification. Let's pause here to see how you do.
Understanding of interest rate. Suppose you had $100 in a saving account and the interest rate was 2% per year. After 5 years, how much would you have in the account if you left the money to grow? More than 102, exactly 102, less than 102, don't know, refuse to answer. If you have $100 in saving and it gives you 2% per year, after 1 year, you'll get 102. So obviously it's more than 102. Question number 2, imagine the interest rate on your saving account was 1% per year and inflation was 2% per year. After 1 year, would you be able to buy A, more than today, 2, exactly the same as today, C, less than today, D, don't know, E, refuse to answer. Interest rate is 1%, so you get 1% every year for your saving account, but the inflation is 2%, so inflation is more than the interest rate. So therefore, you would be able to buy less than today. Question number 3, do you think that the following statement is true or false? Buying a single company stock usually provides a safer return than a stock mutual fund. The answer is false. Buying a single company stock usually riskier than buying a mutual fund, because with a mutual fund, you're actually diversifying into multiple stocks. So if one stock goes down, your entire portfolio is not going to go down. But if you have all your eggs in one basket, then you drop that basket, well, the eggs going to break. So question number 1, we got the answer is more than 102. Question number 2 is less than today. And question number 3 is false.
Literate.
There we go.
Someone who is financially illiterate doesn't know what to do with their money, where their money's going, where their money currently lives, and doesn't even know the options.
Getting these answers right requires both a knowledge of financial vocabulary and the ability to make mental calculations. It takes time to understand this stuff.
You can't just learn the basics in 1 or 2 days and then call it good.
In other words, financial literacy is a lot like, literacy. You can't just sit through one class on the alphabet and then expect to be able to pick up War and Peace. And you can't sit through one lesson on money management and expect to know exactly how to handle your own finances. The problem is, that's exactly how a lot of us were taught about these concepts. Since 1998, the Independent Council for Economic Education has been tracking legislative requirements at the state level for high school financial classes. And their data shows that back then, at least 21 states offered some form of financial education. And by 2011, nearly every state did. It's hard to tell how many of us actually took those classes, given that a lot of them weren't mandatory. But somewhere between learning about the Boston Tea Party for the 10th time and that one day spent on World War I, your history teacher might have taken a crack at teaching you about credit card debt. But in the not-so-distant past, US schools actually taught financial education pretty differently. We'll hear more about that after a word from...
Let's be real here. Learning history is kind of a useless. It's cool to know about what happened in the past and we can learn from it, but it doesn't make sense to me to learn exactly what year that war happened, we can just Google things now. So why do we have to memorize these things? I just find that utterly useless.
We don't have great records of education standards from before the 80s when the Department of Education was formed, but based on old teaching materials, it seems that up until the 50s or 60s, money management was a fixture in the public school curriculum. Often as part of home economics class. Alongside, sewing and baking, students were learning how to budget for better living, use consumer credit, and save for their weddings. There were also standalone consumer education classes, which seemed to be less gendered. But that started to shift thanks to the space race. Worried that American students weren't measuring up to students in the USSR, in 1958, President Eisenhower signed the National Defense Education Act, which placed an importance on math, science, and foreign languages. And years later, the US Department of Education published a landmark report that partially blamed the country's decline in educational performance on schools spending their time training their students for adulthood. That same document doubled down on Eisenhower's math and science-based educational goals, proposing new basics for nationwide curriculums. Since then, a steady march of legislation has made curriculums more and more focused on standardized testing, leaving even less room for life skills like financial education. But thankfully, for at least the past decade, the pendulum appears to be swinging back. More and more students are receiving the kind of financial education that might stick, spending full semesters learning about things like household budgeting, taxes, credit management, and student loans. In 2022, 9 states required a standalone class to graduate. Another 14 required that students receive personal finance lessons within a different course, and 5 more states offered it as an elective.
So access has definitely ramped up dramatically.
And as of February 2024, at least 7 more states have active bills that would introduce mandatory classes, and there's good reason to be optimistic that more states will follow suit. Many of these bills even have rare bipartisan sponsorship, likely because financial education really works. It's been shown to improve credit scores, lower delinquency rates, reduce risky payday lending, and lead students to low-interest college financing. It even has a sort of trickle-up effect on the students' families and even the class's teachers. Researchers are also in the early phases of learning more about what kinds of lessons work best, and which don't really stick, like any planning for retirement. Maybe because that's just a bit too far off for high schoolers. So it might only be a matter of time before Americans remember as much about compound interest as they do about cellular energy production, and as much about inflation as the dimensions of triangles.
Yeah, like that's good news that they're putting all these policies and whatever requirements for kids to learn about their personal finance. So that's great news. But I hope that they continue to spread that across, from the young age to when you're finished high school. Because, we learn math from grade 1 to grade 12, right? So it should be the same way when it comes to financial literacy. You're not going to remember if you don't practice it. And also, there's another side of money that they haven't addressed, and that's emotion. Because a lot of our spending is not logical, but it's more compulsive in a way that you have to control your emotion when it comes to money. Say you see a nice dress that you want to buy, that's probably not a needs but a want. What if you can't afford a want? So there's an emotion factor come into play when it comes to money, and I think that should be addressed more often. Money is not a math problem, it's more than just that. But yeah, great to hear that they are doing something about financial literacy, because obviously if people doesn't know about these things, then when they become an adult, it's not that they're stupid that they get into all these money problems. It's more like they're ignorant. They were never taught